In the next few minutes, you're going to discover how a seemingly unthinkable decision by Canada could reshape your daily life. Picture this: grocery prices spiraling higher, dealerships facing mysterious shortages, and energy bills that creep up with no warning. At first glance, it might look like just another bump in international relations, but beneath the surface lies a major economic shift that could upend the way North America, and possibly the whole world, does business. The big question is, why would Canada, long considered one of the United States' most reliable partners, turn away billions of dollars in imports? And more importantly, why now? By the time you finish reading, you'll understand exactly what's driving this move and how it could affect everything from your paycheck to your retirement. Let's pull back the curtain and explore the real story behind Canada's decision. There's more to it than just trade disputes and political posturing. This is about survival, strategy, and an undercurrent of global shifts that have been quietly building for years. We're going to trace the hidden origins of this economic turning point, unmask the industries that are most at risk, and uncover how everyday families end up paying the price. You'll see how Canada's pivot not only disrupts your next trip to the grocery store or the car dealership, but might also open the door for new global alliances that could redefine power structures in ways we haven't seen before. By the end, you'll realize that this isn't just another headline. It's an unfolding saga with real stakes, involving billions of dollars, international intrigue, and the potential to redefine the future of North American trade. Buckle up, because the story is far from over, and each new revelation may be more surprising than the last. Contrary to popular belief, Canada's drastic change in trade policy didn't happen overnight. For decades, smaller tensions simmered under the radar. On the surface, both countries appeared harmoniously interlinked. Cross-border business deals flourished, goods and services flowed with minimal barriers, and people on both sides enjoyed a sense of mutual economic benefit. Behind the scenes, however, Canadian policymakers had been growing uneasy. They watched as the United States engaged in trade wars with other major economies, imposing tariffs and sanctions that often blindsided allies and rivals alike. Rumor has it that certain high-level Canadian officials started meeting in secret, mapping out contingency plans should these aggressive tactics ever come knocking on Canada's door. Those hush-hush meetings, according to some insiders, yielded sobering revelations. Canada's prosperity was tethered too tightly to a single partner. What would happen if something, political upheaval, another global crisis, or an unexpected policy shift suddenly derailed that relationship? The answers weren't reassuring. A series of underreported diplomatic spats further frayed the relationship. Some revolve around environmental policies. Canada has taken a more aggressive stance on clean energy, while the US has, at times, rolled back regulations. Others revolve around intellectual property disputes. Canadian tech startups have long complained about what they call uneven playing fields in patent law and data sharing agreements. These simmering grievances, though often overshadowed by larger headlines, contributed to the overall climate of distrust. So while everyday people went about their business, a framework was quietly forming. Discreet foreign delegations visited Ottawa, forging new ties. Trials were run, logistical paths explored. By the time a series of small policy disagreements flared into bigger disputes, Canada already had a roadmap. The big shock for most observers is that they were so prepared, so quickly, to pivot away from the status quo. Publicly, Canadian leaders remained cordial, repeatedly affirming their friendship with the US. But behind closed doors, they were speeding up negotiations with European, Asian, and even African partners. The ultimate goal: safeguard the Canadian economy from what they viewed as a precarious dependency on a neighbor prone to protectionist swings. When news of Canada's pivot broke, most folks in the United States had no idea what it really meant. Then the ripple effects started hitting home. American farmers, especially those in the Midwest, were blindsided. Overnight, they lost a reliable export market for wheat, soybeans, dairy, and more. While they scrambled to find replacement buyers overseas, surplus goods began piling up, slashing prices and putting smaller farming operations at risk of going under. The auto sector took a major punch as well. Countless US car manufacturers rely on Canadian factories for parts that now suddenly became harder and more expensive to acquire. Production delays led to higher costs, and some assembly lines were forced to halt altogether. With each passing day, unprepared manufacturers faced the grim choice: adapt immediately or drown in red ink. Then there's the tech world. At first glance, one might assume it would be immune, but many cutting-edge components used by American tech giants components are produced or refined in Canada. That pipeline began to choke almost instantly, leaving some electronics firms scrambling for alternatives. Research collaborations that once thrived on easy cross-border cooperation face new barriers, slowing down progress on everything from AI breakthroughs to data center technology. Suddenly, executives in major US corporations found themselves in crisis mode. They convened emergency meetings, scoured for alternative suppliers, and tried to renegotiate contracts. But such processes can't be completed overnight. Some companies braced for lengthy disruptions, with product rollouts delayed and investors growing uneasy. Meanwhile, small and mid-sized businesses that depended on stable, cost-effective imports from Canada felt the pinch the hardest. Without the same financial cushions as large corporations, they risked shutdowns or forced mergers. Entrepreneurs who once praised cross-border commerce as a pillar of their business models suddenly faced the possibility of closing their doors. For ordinary people, these industry-level crises might feel distant at first, but as manufacturers raise prices to cope with costly supply chains, consumers feel the impact. Everything from groceries to gadgets inches upward in cost, ushering in a new normal where scarce imports and higher expenses become part of daily life. Policies can seem abstract, but their consequences land squarely on real people. Within days of Canada's announcement, supermarket shelves in many US cities began to look a little emptier, especially in stores that once carried specialty items sourced from across the border. Those products that did remain often had steeper price tags, leaving shoppers in disbelief over the sudden jump in costs. Gas stations are feeling it too. With Canadian oil and imports no longer a given, fuel prices are inching upward. The logistics of acquiring oil from alternative sources isn't as smooth or cheap, which translates to higher transportation costs overall. Truckers who previously made seamless cross-border runs find themselves tangled in fresh red tape. Delivery services rack up bigger bills to cover costlier fuel, and before long, that feeds back into the prices consumers pay at the register. Car dealerships are another hotspot for immediate change. Some new vehicles that rely on Canadian manufactured components are hitting production snags. Where there was once an abundance of options, dealerships are now struggling to maintain a decent inventory. Shoppers walking the lot might see fewer models available, with sales teams apologetically explaining that the one they want is delayed or simply impossible to get. This can quickly turn frustration into sticker shock as supply shrinks and prices inevitably climb. Small businesses, particularly those that specialized in niche Canadian goods, face an uphill battle too. Gift shops that sold artisanal products or online retailers offering Canadian snacks find their orders stalled or outright canceled. For them, the question is how to pivot fast enough to stay afloat. The psychological strain is also palpable. Families juggling monthly budgets now have to decide which essentials can be replaced with cheaper alternatives, or which leisure items can be cut altogether. It's not just an inconvenience, it's a lifestyle shift, one that reinforces how global economics can transform everyday reality in the blink of an eye. As these changes take hold, the conversation around the dinner table shifts too. Parents find themselves explaining to their kids why favorite treats from Canada aren't available anymore, or why they can't afford certain brand name items they once bought without a second thought. The entire scenario underscores how decisions made by a handful of policymakers in Ottawa can ripple across the continent, affecting lives in ways both big and small. Whenever a major trade route closes or becomes less reliable, new ones open up. That's exactly what's happening in the aftermath of Canada's dramatic pivot. With billions of dollars worth of imports no longer bound for the United States, other nations are stepping in to claim a slice of the pie. European powerhouses like Germany and France have already shown interest in boosting exports to Canada, offering the machinery, pharmaceuticals, and high-end technology that Canada once primarily sourced from the US Asian giants. Aren't sitting still either. Japan and China are intensifying discussions with Canadian officials to secure deals on everything from consumer electronics to raw materials. Perhaps the biggest shakeup is in the energy sector. Canada, a leading oil and natural gas producer, has long channeled a large portion of its output to American refineries. But strategic agreements with Europe, Asia, and even the Middle East are now diversifying its client base. This not only stabilizes Canada's energy revenue, but also loosens the knot that once bound Canada to the whims of US policymakers. What makes this especially significant is the shift in global alliances it implies. The United States used to be the default partner for Canada, geographically convenient, politically aligned, and deeply integrated through decades of cooperation. Now, however, new trade agreements are signed that sidestep Washington's influence entirely. Crucially, diplomats in Ottawa speak confidently of a future where Canadian economic growth doesn't hinge on a single ally. It's a gamble, but one that seems meticulously planned. At the same time, these alliances reflect a broader international movement toward diversification. No single nation, be it China or the US, can claim to be the solitary hub of global trade. Multiple corridors are taking shape, linking nations in flexible networks that could prove more resilient in times of crisis. For many observers, Canada's pivot is a microcosm of that global trend, a bold statement that no superpower can be entirely trusted when trade wars and political disputes become the new norm. Further underscoring this shift are new tech alliances. Canadian AI labs, for instance, are reportedly partnering with researchers in Europe to develop cutting-edge machine learning tools, bypassing some long-standing relationships with American universities and corporations. This reorientation of research collaborations may have long-term implications for who leads in the AI arms race, potentially giving Canada a bigger role on the global stage while diminishing US influence. Of course, massive geopolitical moves rarely come without a swirl of controversies and speculation. Some critics argue that Canadian leaders timed their announcement to coincide with internal political struggles in the United States, deliberately leveraging a moment of vulnerability. Others whisper about backroom deals with rival superpowers, implying that Ottawa might have traded loyalty for lucrative contracts under the table. Hard evidence of any clandestine arrangement is difficult to come by, yet the whispers persist, adding another layer of mystery to an already tense situation. Could it be that Canada has been courting certain Asian and Middle Eastern nations for years, waiting to pull the trigger only when the US needed Canada the most? That's one rumor that keeps popping up in industry circles. Even within Canada, not everyone is on board. Some local leaders worry that turning away from a long-trusted partner could have unanticipated consequences down the line. What if Canada's new allies prove unreliable or develop competing interests? But these skeptics are overshadowed by those who see this as the next evolution, an opportunity to stand as a more independent economic force on the global stage. For those close to the decision-making process, the motivation is both pragmatic and philosophical. Pragmatic in the sense that relying too heavily on the United States puts Canada at risk every time Washington changes course. Philosophical because many in Canada's leadership, according to insiders, believe that forging a multipolar trade environment is the only way to guard against the volatility of modern geopolitics. Whether that bet pays off or not is still to be seen, but the ripple effects are undeniably real. There's also a cultural dimension. Some Canadians feel that embracing a broader array of international partners will help the country assert a more distinct identity, separate from its neighbor. In a globalized world, identity can be as important as economics, and forging new alliances can signal a strong national stance. The line between practical trade policy and national pride can sometimes blur, influencing decisions that go beyond spreadsheets and bottom lines. Every major economic shift sets off a chain reaction, and in this case, the United States is caught in the epicenter of a gathering storm. With Canada no longer absorbing American goods at previous levels, several sectors are hitting a slump. That slump, if it deepens and spreads, could trigger a recession in the US, echoing the aftermath of past global trade conflicts. The warning signs are everywhere. Inflation, already worrisome, could escalate further as alternative markets prove more expensive or less efficient. Businesses facing lost revenue look for ways to cut costs, often by shrinking their workforce. Those layoffs reduce consumer spending, which in turn dampens business profits even more, forming a vicious cycle that's hard to interrupt. Historically, trade wars and major shifts in import-export relationships have contributed to economic downturns. Think back to the Great Depression or the oil crises of the 1970s. While the circumstances differ, the pattern of cause and effect, lost markets, job cuts, inflation, and reduced consumer confidence remains consistent. If the United States does slide into recession, the ramifications will reverberate globally. Financial markets hate uncertainty, and the possibility of a weakened US economy typically spooks investors worldwide. Meanwhile, interest rates might rise as the Federal Reserve tries to control inflation, making it harder for businesses and individuals to borrow money. Government bailouts, emergency measures, and a flurry of negotiations with foreign trade partners might follow. None of these can instantly reverse the momentum once it starts. It's a slow, grinding process, and everyday people are the ones most affected, those facing job losses, higher living costs, and dwindling prospects for a swift economic recovery. Moreover, a potential recession could undermine the United States' broader global standing. With many nations already wary of Washington's unpredictable trade policies, a weakened U.S. economy could accelerate the trend of countries looking elsewhere for stability. The U.S., long considered the anchor of the global financial system, might find itself grappling with a credibility gap, one that can't be patched by quick political fixes. One of the most provocative angles in this entire saga is how it could inadvertently bolster China. For years, the United States has tried to hem in China's global influence by limiting its access to cutting-edge tech, imposing tariffs on Chinese imports, and discouraging American companies from partnering too closely with Beijing. But with Canada's decision to distance itself from US imports, China stands ready to swoop in. After all, supply gaps create opportunities. Beijing has significant industrial capacity, a huge appetite for raw materials, and a government eager to forge new international trade deals. The more the United States withdraws or is pushed out of its traditional roles, the more room China has to expand its network of economic relationships. This isn't just about selling cheaper goods or flooding markets with Chinese electronics, it's about reshaping trade corridors so that key nations, Canada included, become less reliant on US influence. And once a trading network is established, it can take years, if not decades, to reverse. The knock-on effect is that American corporations might find themselves isolated in critical industries, their technology overshadowed by collaborative efforts involving China, Europe, and other major economies. Some analysts go so far as to suggest that the recent Canada-US split is the perfect opening for Beijing to deepen its presence in North America, possibly through partnerships or investments that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Although there's no guarantee China will fully capitalize on this situation, the potential is undeniable. On the geopolitical chessboard, every move has a counter move. Right now, the US is attempting to navigate a rapidly changing environment, but with Canada striking out on its own and forging new alliances, the American position is no longer as secure as it once was. If the US loses not only a major trade partner, but also paves the way for China to gain a foothold, that represents a shift in power that could shape the global order for decades. It's also a lesson in unintended consequences. The very policies meant to contain Beijing might be paving its pathway to global prominence. If other nations follow Canada's lead and diversify their trade away from the US, the shift in economic power could become a tidal wave. Beijing has spent years building relationships through initiatives like the Belt and Road, and it may now be poised to reap the benefits, leaving Washington to pick up the pieces. So where do we end up? We've got Canada, once the poster child of reliability in North American trade, making a daring move to cut billions in imports from the United States. We see US industries reeling, from agriculture to automotive, and an anxious population bracing for higher prices on everything from groceries to home appliances. We watch as global alliances shift, forging new paths that sideline the long-standing US-Canada relationship, while simultaneously drawing nations like China closer to the action. This isn't a story with a neat, tidy ending. It's an ongoing saga that could evolve in directions most experts haven't even considered yet. Will Canada's gamble pay off, securing its economic independence and opening doors to more diversified trade, or will it face unforeseen risks that send it running back into the arms of its southern neighbor? For the United States, the stakes are equally high. Can it adapt to a world where it's no longer the de facto center of North American trade? Or is this the harbinger of a broader decline in US economic dominance, one that other countries will exploit to their advantage? One thing is for sure, no matter how the pieces ultimately fall, this development has already changed the way we think about trade, alliances, and global power dynamics. As you watch prices rise, job markets shift, and new trade deals emerge in unexpected corners of the world, you might be asking yourself, have we just witnessed the opening chapter of an entirely new world order, or is this simply another twist in a cycle that will one day reset? Only time and the next series of global upheavals will tell. Until then, every grocery bill, every car purchase, and every monthly budget meeting in both Canada and the US will carry the weight of these tectonic changes. In the end, we may discover that this bold move by Canada was less a break from the past and more a glimpse into the economic landscape of tomorrow.